Hope. I won't say these words this morning because you've memorized them already. Our journey in hope continues in part 4 of our series here in Lent. I want to start off by reminding you of one of our great Americans, a man named Benjamin Franklin. Probably the most important figure in all of our American history, especially when it comes to the birth of our nation. You may not know it, but Benjamin Franklin was old enough so that George Washington was only half his age. In fact, Ben Franklin had a son that was slightly older than George Washington. Franklin was not only involved as a printer, but he became a statesman. He was an inventor and uttered probably one of the most interesting statements about how we change as we age. Are you ready for it? Here it is. Many people die at age 25 and are not buried until they're 75. Should I say it again? Many people die at age 25, but they're not buried until they're age 75. Now, this comes from a man who was not afraid of change. In fact, if you read his life history over and again, he changed. He moved with the times. He was a slave owner in his early years and decried it before he passed. 2 more reading on Benjamin Franklin, but not at the expense of reading about Jesus, who lived a life of continual change so that we can be transformed. So let's talk about, in this time of penitence and prayer and sacrificial giving, let's talk about hope and 4 more kinds of hope in Lent. One of them, transforming hope. We read that in the book of Isaiah. The second, harvesting hope, a change that happens in Psalm 126. The third, pressing on hope, from a guy who never gave up learning and trying to teach us to do the same. And finally, cornerstone hope in Jesus. And I think that last one is going to be something that hits your heart. Transforming hope. Isaiah, remember not the former things, nor consider things of old. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? In other words, Isaiah is saying, you better be ready for continual change. In other words, say bye to bygones. Don't be stuck in reverse. Welcome change. Remember not the former things means let ancestral records rest in their place. Don't live there. Yes, we just read a beautiful commandment that talked about honoring your father and mother. Why? Because they gave birth to you and they teach you wisdom. That's a covenant they make with God. But your faith should not be the faith of your father and mother. It should be your faith. God has no grandchildren. You are his child. You need to be changing. Not long ago, I met a scientist who was sure that God doesn't exist. And I said, how are you sure? Well, I just know it. I said, how do you know? He hadn't realized it, but he'd slipped into my field of philosophy and theology. He'd left science. Well, how do you know it? Well, I just know. Well, how do you just know? Have you tested it? And I jumped back into his field of science. Well, you can't test God. I said, so how do you know? Well, I just know. I said, no, you don't. Respectfully, no, you don't. But I can give you some information that helps you with your testing. And by the way, in Romans 1, it says, don't get to the point where you are not able to test adokemos, which means, by the way, from science, the inability to test qualitatively and quantitatively. He said, oh. I said, no. Don't get stuck in the past. Let history teach you so that hopefully you don't repeat it. But don't get stuck in the past, nor consider things of old. Don't try to discern to relive ancient days. I think a lot of us like to think of ourselves in some way, shape, or form as conservative. But conservative doesn't mean died at 25, not buried till 75. Things have to change. Have you ever bought a new car? Why? Because the old one changed from being a new car to an old car, and it died. So you bought a new car. Did the new car have anything new on it that you didn't have in the old car? Yes. If you bought a hybrid, you got both an electric and a gasoline motor. How's that working for you today? Think about that question. I know, how's it working for you today to have a hybrid? And most of us aren't responding because we still have gas cars. We're still going to the pump and doing what the lady next to me did the other day. How is it this expensive? She obviously hadn't bought gas in the last month. Things have changed. Now, I don't know if you're going to be in the market for an electric car, but wow, if gas prices keep going up, which we hope they don't, but if they do, you might start thinking about that option. And then those of you who would like to buy an older gas car will get it really inexpensively. Nor consider things of old. Don't try to discern to relive the ancient days. Things change. And so do we. Unless we die long before we're buried. Harvesting hope. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. That verse touches my heart. Let me tell you why. A number of years ago, a friend of mine named Danny Curl went to be a missionary in a part of North Africa where he observed this happen. At the beginning of the year after harvest, notice I said at the beginning of the year after harvest, food is plentiful. Everybody gets to eat 3 times a day. And as Danny watched his parishioners, he watched the food supply begin to dwindle, and then everybody ate twice a day. And as the year went on and the food supply dwindled more, then they ate once a day. And he tells the story about a man in his congregation who had a little boy who walked with him to the little shack where they kept seed for the next year. One day, the little boy looked at the big bag of seed and he said, "Papa, we can use this to feed our family." And the father said, "No, this is our seed for next year." "But Papa, I'm so hungry." "No, this is our seed for next year." That night, at the non-existent dinner table, the little boy came to the dad and said, "Papa, I'm so hungry. Just a handful." He said, "No, we have enough. And we have seed for next year." The dry season came. The food dwindled even more. People began to starve in Danny's church, so he sold the missionary furniture to raise money to feed his congregation. And they fired him because he sold the missionary furniture to feed his congregation. And then one morning there was the promise of rain far away. And as the clouds got closer, the farmer told his son, come with me and help me. So together they went to the little shack, and he pulled the bag of seed down, and he said, very carefully, a few grains in each hole. And he made a hole with a stick, and they put a few grains in, and the sprinkling started. And they walked through that whole field that day. And the little boy looked at his father and said, Papa, is it raining on your old head, or are you crying? And the papa said, I'm crying because I know it's going to take a few more weeks for this seed to give us a harvest so that we can eat 3 meals again and you won't be hungry. A few weeks later, the plants had sprung up. The grain was ready to be harvested, and everybody ate 3 meals again. The first sheaves that came in, the farmer and his son came running across the field toward the place where the grain is separated from the chaff, shouting with joy because they now had food. We have that kind of hope in the middle of the distress that we face every day. Things are not ever going to be as perfect as we would like them to be. Our health will fail. Be disappointed about circumstances as they don't work out for us. We'll get older. We'll get sick. Some will die. But we keep sowing so that we keep reaping. That's change. But it must happen in order for us to live. It's a whole process, after all. Sow in tears, reap in joy, go out weeping, bearing seed, come home shouting, bringing sheaves means wait, means hope. Harvesting hope goes along with transforming hope. What about pressing on hope? Paul writes these words to the business people in the ancient world who are always accustomed to change. New products, new ideas, new contracts, new. Try something new. Beat out the competition. But one thing I do, forgetting the products I brought in last year. That's not what it says, but that's what it means. Forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Jesus Christ. Let those of us who are mature think this way, think change. And if in anything you think otherwise, God will reveal that also to you. In other words, if you're dying and it's still a long time to be buried, you have hope. God can change you. Notice the theme is the same here in Philippians as it was in Isaiah. God is doing new things. Henry Blackaby, in one of his books about spiritual life, says this: find out what God is doing and join him there. If you don't have an idea what God is doing, find out where he's doing something and get there. Join him there. Maybe you won't lead it, but maybe you'll participate in it. And the more experience you'll get, you will change. I call this in the sermon this morning, one thing living. Here's what one thing is. We start at the bottom. I press on toward the goal. And in fact, the strength of this passage doesn't just mean pursue, it means persecute. I'm working so hard on this. I'm going to make it happen. Forgetting what lies behind. In other words, let go of what's backwards. Strain forward to what lies ahead. Reach forward in time and space. Kai had a track meet yesterday. When I saw him in the afternoon, I said, "How'd it go?" "Not so good. Maybe a little more straining, maybe a little more pressing on." What is it that causes us to succeed when it looks like we're going to fail? What is it that causes us to fail when it looks like we're going to succeed? Coach K. Everybody expected Duke to win by 4 points. But in the last 90 seconds, they lost to the North Carolina Tar Heels. So Coach K, who's finishing his coaching career, goes out one game short of a national championship that he was favored to win. What happened? Pressing on. 90 seconds to go. That's all it can sometimes be. A 90-second decision to not change. And it's done. But I'm too old to change. Abraham did when he was 75. He had a child when he was 100. Not suggesting anything, but you know my point. As we mature, we begin to realize things change. Transformation is necessary. The seed to harvest process is important. And we need to press on. Think if the farmer dad in the previous passage had not pressed on, and he had let his family eat the seed for the next harvest. Finally, Cornerstone hope. But he looked directly at them. This is the scribes and the chief priest, the religious intelligentsia, the people who make the rules and who write them down. He's looking at them and he says, "What then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush it." Sounds ominous, doesn't it? But I want you to see something about the change that happens in this passage. Notice it goes from rejection to victory. How did that happen? You know, most of our modern understanding of who Jesus is sees Jesus not so much as a carpenter, but as a stonemason. There are key words in the New Testament that point more that direction than our traditional understanding. Either way, it was likely that Jesus was in the Union and that he knew very well how to prosecute his trade. So is it any wonder that we have this passage in the New Testament, in the Gospels, talking about masonry rather than joining pieces of wood together? Because Jesus is going to know what this all means. Have you ever seen a stonemason, not a bricklayer, but a stonemason, do his task? It's really fascinating. The stonemason has a pile of stone. It looks like rubble to the rest of us. But he picks up a stone and he begins flipping it in his hand, sideways, up and down. And he looks at the stone and he looks at the space where it's going, and he keeps flipping it until he does one of two things. Either picks up his hammer and chips away a few things and then fits it perfectly into the spot, or he flips it to another pile. He's tested it, he's tried it, and sometimes he uses it and other times he disqualifies it or discards it. That's what's being spoken of here. A rejected stone. It comes right from the words in Scripture. A rejected stone has been tested and disqualified or tried and disapproved of. Think about the life of Jesus. We're getting to that point. And in fact, even the end of this text. His first entry into the temple, after he leaves Jerusalem, it says that they planned to execute him. And then much later, when this story is being told in the Gospels, the scribes and the Pharisees wanted to lay a hand on him, but they were afraid of the people. The crowd was probably bigger than they were. But he was saying, you rejected me. And the parable is really about prophets. One prophet after the other has gone to tell Israel that there's a need for them to change, and they don't change. So finally, the beloved Son is sent, and they kill him. Does Jesus know rejection? Could you shake your fist in his face and say, you've never experienced life like me? I've been pushed around. I've been beaten up. I've never had enough. You don't understand my life. Oh, really? Oh, really? The rejected stone becomes the cornerstone. It literally means the head of the angle or corner from which everything finds its place. Nowadays, we put cornerstones in last because we have all kinds of digital ways to make things work. But in the ancient world, a cornerstone had three functions. When it sat, it was meant to show plumb. It was meant to show the lines of the building going in different directions. And depending how it was cut, it could tell you whether this building was going to be square or rectangular or octagonal. It was the keystone, the head of the corner angle. Not head as we think of it up on top, but head as we think about it down here. Like your philosophy of education before you educate people. You need the philosophy in order to educate them well. The cornerstone then becomes a crushing stone. What does that mean? Well, in the understanding of this particular passage, it means that no matter what you do, because the cornerstone has such an exalted place, everything else is dust. And this doesn't just mean make gravel. This means to crush to powder. In other words, chief priests and scribes, everything you're doing will be blown to the wind because of the strength of the gospel. Look at the change from rejection to exaltation to eternity. That's why we have hope. As we're 1 week away from going into Holy Week, Jesus has won. We are God's children and his brothers and sisters. We don't hang our heads because of what happens during Lent. We don't hang our heads because of what happens during Passion Week. We straighten up and we take that victory because Jesus has won it already. We don't bow down to the culture. Jesus has crushed the culture. More than 2 billion of us continue to crush the culture, not to destroy the culture, but to infuse it with life. To give it shape and presence because of Jesus, who is the chief cornerstone. Be sad. But let your sadness be filled with hope. Because as Paul wrote to another group who were afraid of death, he said, we sorrow not as those who have no hope. Yes, we sorrow, but we have hope in the middle of sorrow. Hope that transcends sorrow. Hope that transforms. Hope that has a promise of a harvest, especially of souls. Hope that begs us to press on, to persevere. Hope because of Jesus, the cornerstone. Now you have 16 kinds of hope through Lent. And I'll say 17. Because last week, Father Larry gave you a story that some of you said, I'll never forget. Breaking the legs of the sheep, putting the sheep around the neck, and spending all that time with that little lamb, or maybe that somewhat heavy adolescent sheep, so that the sheep will not wander. Pastoral or caring hope. Hope in the midst of penitence and prayer and sacrifice. It is worth it. And everyone said, Amen. Maybe I wasn't speaking English then. Everyone said, Amen. What kind of hope do you need? There's hope in transformation, hope of a harvest, so press on in hope, aligning your future to Cornerstone hope in Jesus. What might also be important about this sermon? We're going into a time of transition as a church. We've been through so many. God is bringing new leaders. God is helping us keep some old leaders. Together, we're going to move forward in hope. That means there's going to be change. And everybody said, Amen. Can I give you a woohoo moment? Just from Friday night and yesterday. Every once in a while, I get to be a car guy. So I got to be a car guy with Kai on Friday. His alternator went bad, and you know what happens when your alternator goes bad. Nothing works, right? So we talked about it, and we pulled apart the car and took out the alternator. And I took a picture of him with the alternator like this. First time he'd ever taken an alternator out. He was happy. But he still wasn't really happy because a car without an alternator is not going anywhere. So we got the alternator tested, we got the battery tested. And guess what? We found out the battery was dead and the alternator was also dead. They couldn't get us an alternator on Friday, but they could on Saturday morning. So we got one on Saturday morning. And we put it in. And then I said, Kai, we took the triumphant picture when you took the alternator out. I want to get a video of what happens when you start the car for the first time. I want to see the expression on your face when that motor turns over. None of you, of course, are thinking that this car is not going to start, right? Because we had no leftover parts. We had tested everything. It was ready to go. So I stood back and I took the video. He turned the car over. It cranked. It ran. He goes like this. And then he looked at the gauges, and they were all dead. But the car was running. So I said, let's try the fuse. We pulled out a fuse, pushed it back in, the gauges worked. Life was good again. Hope. Yeah, it was dead. Now it's alive. We would be dead in our trespasses and sins, but we're alive in Jesus. Hope.